Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We are here with the Islamic Center of Passaic County today, presenting a session titled Before You Tie the Knot with Sister Menahal Begawala. Thank you so much for joining us, Sister Menahal.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم. أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. ربنا زدنا علما. So, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, everyone.
Let me introduce you, Sister Menahal, to our community. Today, Sister Menahal will be focusing on the topics of knowing yourself and tying in the past with the present and how this impacts your relationships, as well as realistic expectations and what it means to be in love. Sister Menahal is a licensed mental health counselor in New York. She has completed marriage counseling training through the Gottman Institute, world-renowned for its work on marriage stability and divorce prediction. She partnered with the Institute to author the Islamic Reference Guide for the Gottman Method. Menahal has also pursued a specialization in trauma treatment with the Sensory Motor Psychotherapy Institute, a modality of somatic psychotherapy that taps into the body's innate intelligence to enhance the effectiveness of therapy and healing from trauma. She conducts workshops on parenting, wellness, marriage, and addictions, among others. Currently, Sister Menahal has a private practice where she works as a mental health counselor, covering a client base with a broad range of mental health issues and trauma through individual, family, and couples therapy. Having a background of Islamic and Quranic studies as well, Sister Menahal is passionate about bringing about awareness of mental, emotional, and physical wellness through an Islamic lens to the community. It's an honor to have you, Sister Menahal.
Jazakumullahu khairan, Sister Rana, for the introduction and for having me here today. So I want to start just with a question for the audience, and I believe that there are people that they can type comments into the box, right?
Correct.
And so I want to start by hearing from everyone who's tuning in about what your perceptions are on the term love. Like, from your perspective, what does it mean to be in love? You know, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to give me some feedback on that, because I want to know where you're coming from. I want to, I don't want to reiterate something that everyone already knows. I also want to see what the beliefs are so that we can address them in terms of strengthening the beliefs that are healthier, that are more productive, and then also maybe debunking some myths. So I'll give everyone a moment to share, your thoughts on that. So as people, hopefully comment, the one thing that I will say that I see a lot of times in premarital counseling, when I work with couples who are thinking about getting married, one of the pieces that I see, people say is that, yeah, we can talk for hours. We can, and there's this like excitement and looking forward to talking to the other person. There's this kind of that butterflies in the stomach feeling that comes up. And so, that is one part of being in love. That's one part of having, starting a relationship. Unfortunately, fortunately and unfortunately for this, because the fortunate part is that this tells us that we're interested in someone. This tells us that we're attracted to someone, that there's something that this person brings to the table. However, this feeling that we're talking about, this like in love feeling, also has the potential of making us overlook things. It has a potential of making us very, putting on these rosy glasses where we only see the good, right? A lot of times in marriage counseling, I see that there are couples who say the very thing that they used to adore and find so endearing about their partner in the beginning of the relationship becomes their pet peeve later on, right? So this idea of being in love is natural and normal in the first stage of marriage, but it's not the only thing that should be there. This feeling of being in love, it's a, you know, to simplify it and to take out the sentiment of it, it really is a chemical, you know, shift going on in the body. There's an excitement. There's, you know, there's a lot going on internally, hormonally, that is creating this feeling. And that's all good and well. However, if we get so caught up in this feeling that we start to neglect other aspects of what might be necessary to look at, we can end up in a situation where when this feeling fades, and it will fade, right? The average lifespan of that, like really excited, what we think of as in love, the Hollywood, Bollywood, you know, media presentation of what it means to be in love, on average lasts about 2 years. Right. So if we think about mass media and stuff, we see that a lot of times we see the pursuit of a relationship. We get to the point where the relationship happens, and then that's when the story ends. Like they finally get to be together. We don't see it when this kind of love wears off. And so that's one of the things that I want us to be aware of, right? Is the perception of love. How do we perceive marriage? Because another thing that I see is a lot of times people come into counseling and they say, you know, my perception of what marriage would be like was off. I got hit hard with the reality that it's not just all like holding hands and going for nice walks in the sunset and cuddling and, you know, those kinds of things. That there's a lot more to it, that we all come into marriage with a whole host of baggage, for lack of better words. Right? We all come into marriage with some kind of a background in terms of our perceptions, in terms of our expectations. And so we want to be aware of that idea of being in love in the beginning stages of a relationship, and recognize it as a very emotional and sometimes an obsessive experience, right? And what happens is that when this starts to fade away, the real issues start to come to the surface. Now, if those issues have been ignored or overlooked, or during that phase, a person said, yeah, no, it's not a problem. We'll work it out. We'll figure it out. Our love will take us through. The hard facts are that that particular type of love won't. But the love that can be built, the love that's intellectual and emotional and social in nature can be built in order to enhance the relationship in the long run. So, you know, and whoever's tuning in, if you have questions, if there's something that doesn't make sense, please feel free to put in a comment or a question for clarification, because I can see the comments as they come. And so let's take a look at, you know, what we need when we're talking about before you tie the knot, before you get into a relationship, what needs to happen in order to make sure that the relationship that you're embarking on is going to be healthy, right? Because on one hand, we have, you know, the myths and the, you know, misconceptions, right? We see a lot of situations, and there's no one size fits all to this, right? So in some situations, some people go into the relationship on, you know, what's called like an arranged situation. Two people are introduced by their families. There's some kind of a history there, or they've been in, you know, the families have been introduced by a middle person, and they get to know each other, and like culturally and religiously and everything works out, and they kind of move forward. And that can work great for some people. For some people, that will not work at all, right? And so, you know, another thing that I see often in marriage counseling in this particular type of scenario, which in some cases is ideal. But for some people, I ask them 10 years into their marriage, they're in marriage counseling, did you ever sit down and talk about where you want to be in life 10 years from now? When you were getting married, did you talk about how financially, emotionally, family-wise, you wanted to be, like what you had in mind? And the answer is no. And just because they came from the same cultural background and the same religious background, it doesn't mean that they aligned on all of these other things. It's not automatic, right? And so before getting married, we need to have these really serious conversations about the intellectual, the emotional, the social, right? Like, is one person an introvert, one person an extrovert, right? The spiritual, the physical foundations for marriage. This is part of the idea, we have tawakkul, right? One of the things that as Muslims we do is we do istikhara. And we say, is this person a good fit for me? And we say, let me do istikhara and then go from there, right? We want to make sure that we're putting in our effort, right? The Prophet ﷺ told us to tie your camel, put in your effort, take your precautionary measures, and then rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? The unfortunate reality is that there's no guarantee. However, if we put in our due diligence before the relationship, right, where we don't overlook red flags just because we're in love, right? There are plenty of situations that I see in premarital counseling where there are so many red flags, right? One of the partners keeps putting the other one down or keeps having emotional outbursts, or, it seems to like never be okay, is always, complaining and character assassinating even before the marriage. And they're just so in love that this person's like, no, they just want me to be a better person, right? That's not how it looks like when a person wants you to be a better person. That's not how it works. That's not a healthy way to go about it. And so, we have to pay attention to the red flags, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But we also, so when we do that, then we can rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we always rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But, sometimes I hear people say, I did istikhara and it still didn't work out and I got divorced. Now, I can't say what the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, and there surely is his wisdom. But also, we want to say, okay, well, did you put in your due diligence? We want to find a person to blame when things don't go well. And so that piece on due diligence, I think, is really important. Sister Anna, did you have something you wanted to say?
I did want to say something. I had a question. You spoke about alignment on the intellectual, emotional, and financial levels. So if you can speak about that, what type of alignment are you supposed to look for? So you talked about different personalities and someone being introverted rather than extroverted. And we know that sometimes opposites attract. So what type of alignment exactly are you supposed to be looking for?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question, right? Because some things, there will be complete alignment, and in some things there won't be, right? And in looking for that, what we want to be able to do is say, okay, what are the things that I need alignment on? What are the things that are otherwise deal breakers if we don't align on them, right? What are the things that, so for example, if a person is let's say that one person's a spender, one person's a saver, right? Can they sit down and have an honest conversation and say, yeah, we have two different ways of looking at and dealing with money. And this is a conversation premarital counseling that I have with all of my couples. What are your perceptions on money management? Who's a spender? Who's a saver? What role has money played in your life growing up? If you could use one word to describe money, it would be blank, right? So I ask these kinds of questions to help each person gain an understanding, number one, of themselves, but then also of the other person, and say, okay, we're different here. We don't align, but can we manage it? Because if one person comes from a background where their parents came from a poverty-stricken place, right? And it could go in one of two ways. That person is very, very strong about savings. They must have X amount of dollars in the bank at all times, and they only spend on necessity, and they don't, and they're very strict about that. Then you have another person who grew up maybe similarly. They might think, oh yeah, we both grew up in very tight, in a tight-fisted way. But the other person's response to that was, now I have money, so I'm going to spend it. And I spent my whole life having to hold myself back. And maybe they go a little bit more in that direction. Okay, there's a difference there. Each person has to know themselves. Am I going to be able to live with a partner who functions completely differently than me? Can we have a conversation about what the what the parameters are going to be around that. Can we come to a compromise where one partner says, okay, so long as we have this much money in the bank, and then, the other person says, okay, I can give myself a budget of this much spending per month or 6 months, right? So the alignment is one part of this, right? In all of these different things, whether it's career, whether it's, culture, whether it's finances, whatever it may be. And then the other piece is saying, what can I actually realistically deal with, right? And so, there's a comment about each person doing his or her part, men and women having roles, but we don't live in a time where there's a standard for that anymore. And that's an important conversation in terms of alignment, as you mentioned, Sister Rana, right? That one person, I've now met men who say, no, my wife must work. She must contribute to the household equally as I do. And I've met women who say, absolutely not. If I earn, I shouldn't be expected to contribute to the household if you want me to earn. Or, there's no standard anymore. And that's what we have to realize, is that we don't live, if we lived, let's say, even like 50 years ago in this country, things looked very different. Heck, even like 30 years ago, things looked really different. As times are changing, we have to be aware of that. And that doesn't mean that you have to change. You have a right to your perspective. And if you are more traditionally minded, and then you go and you fall in love with someone who's very, it's like in college, you come from a very traditional family and you have a traditional mindset, and you go to your MSA and there's that like one brother, or sister, or let's say if it's a brother and a sister is like really active and she's like, mashallah, so passionate, and you're attracted to her, but you're expecting her to take that passion and then get married and then to not do that stuff anymore. But that's what attracted you to her to begin with, right? And so the second part of what I want to talk about is really knowing ourselves, right? Really understanding that our family impacts who we are. Our family impacts our values. Either we align with our families or we go against what our families wanted, right? And so we have to look at our family relationships. We have to look at, where are we coming from, and understanding that in order to know our own expectations. In order to know, okay, so there's a comment about, some men get greedy when they see their wife being financially strong. That might be true for some people. It might not be true. I don't take it as a blanket statement, right? It depends on what a person's background is. If a person came from a background where, both parents were equal income earners, and, that might be an expectation. It might be something that they just kind of take for granted. Right. So again, this is, there's no one size fits all approach to this. What's imperative is to know yourself in this process so that you know your own red flags, because I'll tell you something, we have to understand our own tendency. Sister Rona, did you have a question or comment here?
No, that's such a great point that you made in terms of alignment, because people think that they need to be exactly on the same page, and that's not really the case. The case is really comes down to just compromising, just knowing your limitations and knowing your standards and what you can agree to and what you cannot accept. And then coming together and meshing those two values and compromising on them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And we see that in every area, right? Whether it's cultural, whether it's religious, our deen is so beautiful and it has so much flexibility. It's not, recognizing where we stand allows us to know ourselves, because there are, for example, there's in our deen, there is allowance and the beautiful flexibility to have so many different ways for things to be. Khadija radiallahu anha was one way, and Aisha radiallahu anha was another, right? She was a businesswoman, she was a scholar, right? And both of their status we see is elevated, right? Radiallahu anhu. So we see the flexibility in our deen. And so sometimes there's like a very stringent perspective, and that comes back to us. And so I want to switch gears a little bit and talk more about, because this is so important, and that is knowing our own past in order to know what we're doing moving forward, with the intention of understanding how we're moving forward, right? And so we have to look at the background that we came from. If the background that we came from was very black and white, this is right, this is wrong, very stringent, and we continue to carry those ideals or those perceptions, we have to be aware of that in order to have a healthy relationship. Okay, you can be that way, no problem. But are you going to fight your spouse every time they don't fit into that mold, right? You have to understand that. And also, like, taking and I want to actually broaden a little bit, because I want to move away from, from more specific. I want to generalize a little bit more, kind of zone out, pull the lens back a little bit further even, right? Taking a look at the backgrounds that we come from. Growing up, each of our families have different patterns of how they show up, right? How they treat emotion, how they deal with hardship. If there was a history of emotional or other abuse, right? Did you grow up in a home where you were always guilted into compliance? Did you grow up in a home where if you were sad, you were told, just don't be sad, buckle up? Did you grow up in a home where you were punished very often? Did you grow up in a home where you were never punished? Where discipline, didn't exist, everything was like, okay, it's okay, right? Understanding where we came from, taking a deeper look at that, and bringing awareness to it is imperative to building healthy relationships moving forward. Again, if there was any kind of abuse, emotional, verbal, physical, sexual, any kind of abuse, what we see is that those cycles of abuse often repeat. They often find a way of showing up in the next generation. This is what we call intergenerational trauma, right? A lot of clients that I've seen come from terribly emotionally, physically, all kinds of abuse backgrounds. And a lot of times I look at these situations and I learn more about the families. I see that there was tremendous trauma. Some come from war-torn lands where it was literally just about survival. There was no space for emotion. And so those parents raised children in which emotions were not a part, they were not allowed. They were not, forget not allowed, they were punished. And so we have to look at the cycles that were present in our own families. Let's say, you, alhamdulillah, didn't have any kind of overt abuse, but the beliefs around emotion, around gender roles, around, appreciation, around love, right? Those things are all going to have an impact on how you show up in your relationship. One of the things that I always work on with clients, premarital and marital couples rather, is understanding their love language. If you grew up in a home that was generally healthy, right, and there wasn't any kind of overt abuse, and in your home, you saw your father bring home flowers for your mom, and then your mom would go out and she would, bring home, a treat for the children. And you saw that these small gifts were commonplace in the home. And you get married to someone who's very pragmatic about giving gifts. It has to be something practical, and it has to, flowers, they die. What's the point of buying flowers, putting money into something that's going to die? There's going to be a clash there, because one person's going to say, you never get me flowers. How do I, you never think about me. You don't show me that you love me. And this person's going to say, well, when I was growing up, the way that we showed love was helping each other around the house with acts of service. And so you might be showing love, but in a way that doesn't align with the other. And the point here is, again, that there doesn't need to be perfect alignment, but there has to be conversation. And good, healthy, robust conversation can only happen when we've put in the effort to develop enough awareness of ourselves. So where I can say, you know what, yeah, I can see that your family really, they do so much for each other. You know what? And I really appreciate that. But when you bring home flowers for me, that just puts me over the moon. It's something I always saw growing up. And then if there's that kind of a healthy conversation happening, then the other partner can say, yeah, I mean, I think it's nonsense, but it means this much to my partner. Am I willing to do that? Right?
There's
And,
yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, Sister Menahal. There's a comment by Sister Shireen. She mentioned our standards are always relate to our Islamic roles, no matter the time or era we are living in. That's why the farther we are far from our right standards, the more issues we are facing. So if you'd like to comment on that, Sister.
You know, I can see where the comment is coming from, and I don't necessarily agree. And the reason I say that is because while I can see where the comment is coming, and there's truth to it, but I think it's very simplistic. It's taking something that's a much broader, much more complex thing that we're talking about, which is understanding the human mind. We see the Prophet ﷺ, if a Bedouin came to him and he asked him, what do I need to do? He said, just do your 5 pillars and you'll go to Jannah. That's sufficient. And if one of the Sahaba came to him, he gave him far more stringent standards because he knows the capacity of each one. Working with the human being is not so simplistic. And so when we say the right standards Islamically, even the Prophet ﷺ, we see how he dealt with people. It was within the right standards, but there are so many different, that's a very wide range of things. So, you know, what you might consider right, it might be different from what another person considers right. And they could both be right. And that's why a huge piece of getting married, and we're talking about before you tie the knot, is actually taking a look at yourself and say, how willing and capable am I to take different perspectives into consideration? There are some things in Islam that are black and white. We have to pray 5 times a day. That's fard. We have to fast in the month of Ramadan. That's fard. There are things, alcohol, haram. Right? Pork, haram. There are things that are black and white. And you can say, yeah, like these are my deal breakers. I can't marry someone who doesn't, you know, do their basic fara'id, right? Who doesn't pay zakat, who doesn't pray 5 times a day, who doesn't fast on Ramadan, who takes these things lightly, who doesn't mind missing them if they're like out and about, right? Not the partner for me. So those standards, great. But lifestyle standards are going to be different for different couples, depending on where you're living, depending on what, you know, the necessity is. Some households need to have both parents working. That's just a necessity for whatever the reason might be. Some homes that might not be needed. In some homes, it might work for the wife to be the breadwinner. In some homes, that would never fly. The Prophet ﷺ started out being hired by Khadija radiallahu anha. That was one style. That was a standard. Does everyone have to do that, where the wife is, you know, the businesswoman? No. And so, you know, again, I will urge all of us to be really, really self-aware in terms of, if I come to the table myself, being a therapist, you know, having knowledge and training in couples counseling, If I come to the table saying this is right and this is wrong and this is how you must do things, that's a problem. I cannot, being an expert in any field means that you see how much variability and how much nuance there is. If you're unable to see nuance, that means that you have a lot of learning to do. And so if you're going into marriage, if you're going into the realm of looking for a partner and you're looking at things as black and white, right and wrong, you might need to spend a little bit of time developing a little bit more self-awareness and a little bit more awareness of where that thought process is coming from. So moving on from that, coming back to the, awareness, developing and building awareness of who we are, where we come from. As I mentioned, our cycles, patterns of behavior, cycles of abuse, right? These things are likely to be repeated. And so when we talk about, before we tie the knot, looking for red flags, the first thing we need to do is recognize the red flags within ourselves. So when I'm talking to people in counseling, before they, when they're looking for a partner and stuff, a lot of what we do is say, okay, let's understand what's going on inside you. For some people, the moment they notice conflict, the moment they see some kind of, inkling that something might be wrong, you know what their instinct is? Run. And we call it commitment issues, or we call it this. For some people, no matter how bad things they get, they cling on. That's how they relate, right? So, and I'm sure when we think about it, we know people who fall into either category. That is something within them that needs to be addressed. So if I notice that every time I engage in a relationship, I become obsessive and I can't sleep and I'm just constantly thinking, and it's, there's one thing, which is the excitement and, the boost that you get when you're getting to know someone. But there's another piece where it's like, I'm constantly panicked that when I'm not with them, there's something wrong there in me. If on the other hand, the closer I get to someone, the more I want to just ditch them and run, that's also something that I need to look at in myself, because that speaks to my own cycles, right? And so understanding where we come from is really important, because cycles repeat, but they are not destined to repetition. And in order for them to not repeat, we have to take that responsibility to say, okay, where is my thought process? And not just my thought process, because a lot of what we bring into relationships is just how we show up innately in our behavior, in our interactions, and like what we feel, the push and the pull, right? Our habits, how we express love. What do we consider common courtesy? Some families grew up, and I was talking to someone recently, and we were talking about just how sometimes in immigrant culture, children are never told that they did well. Children are never told thank you, because whatever children do is considered, you're doing what you were supposed to do. Why should I thank you? That'll spoil you. And so the idea of saying thank you, or I appreciate that, or yeah, I see how much hard work you put in, for some people, that's not part of their common courtesy. Does it mean that's bad? I'm not going to, no. But it does mean that there's something there that we have to look at to say, I have couples that come in which one partner is like, I can't say sorry. I cannot, I physically cannot bring myself to say sorry. You think rationally, you say, okay, see what I did wrong. Verbally, just say sorry. But there's something inside, right? And that's saying, okay, well, how come? What's going on there? Is that a bad thing? I don't like to stick labels of good or bad on something. Again, unless we're talking about Islamically, what's right and wrong is a different thing. But my question is, how come? What's going on there? So just even these kinds of things, right? So when you're talking about tying the knot, when you're talking to a person, a prospective partner, you want to ask questions like that. Like, how did your family show love? How, what kind of courtesy was expected? How was it acknowledged? Right? What were the values? Was value put on effort? Was value put on achievement? Was value put on how you ranked in relation to others? We see that a lot culturally, comparisons, right? You want to think about again, and all these things you have to know for yourself as well, right? How did your family express emotion? Expressing love isn't one thing, but expressing emotion, right? I have a client who just, as a result of the family dynamics, does not know how to feel anger, even in situations where anger is appropriate. How did your family manage conflict? And these are questions that each one of us has to ask ourselves first before we move into a relationship. Because if we understand that about ourselves, then I can say, okay, in my family, conflict was managed just like you'd have a big fight, and then after that, like pretend like nothing happened. And someone else says, no, we never, ever, ever fought. We never argued. Well, okay, those are two very, very different ways of managing conflict. So if you're thinking about now being together, how are you going to manage that when one partner has this tendency, right? Very outward facing tendency, and another partner has a very inward facing tendency. Does that mean it can't work? No, that's not what it means, but it means that you might have to actually very intentionally be aware of when there's conflict. Notice the patterns that you're both falling into, default patterns that are different, and say, how do we now make them align? How do we bring them together for the sake of our relationship? Does that make sense?
Perfectly.
Yeah. So, and all of this that I'm talking about now will come to the surface after that in love period goes. Like I said, on average, that like excited in love, I'll do anything for my partner, is going to fade on average in about 2 years, plus or minus, depending on the situation. After that, the very thing like, oh yeah, my partner never gets angry, alhamdulillah, like, yeah, it's just, they're so calm. 2 years later, you're going to be like, you're so annoying, you never talk about anything. The same thing is going to turn into, but see, that's where we have that awareness is so important. Because you could just, in the initial phase, like, yeah, mashallah, they just, such a calm person. And the other person might say, you say exactly what's on your mind, and I love that you're so straightforward. I never had that growing up. And then they're like, you're so rude and inconsiderate. You just say whatever comes to your mind. You don't think twice, right? But if there's an awareness around it, even early on, then you can have conversations about it and say, how do we come to terms about these things? These are things that, again, premarital counseling, I talk about with all of my clients to say, okay, how do you manage conflict? Because the way that you manage conflict is going to show up in your relation. There's got to be conflict. There has to be. You're two different human beings. I'm within my own head, I have conflicts with myself sometimes, right? I want one thing and I want another. With another human being, there's bound to be conflict. How you're going to manage that is going to depend on your background in managing conflict. And so these are things that we have to consider. And so I know that we're coming up on 11:40. I wanted to leave some time for question and answer. And I wanted to also address the different types of questions and, conversations that should be addressed before getting married. So I want to leave time for question and answer, and maybe we can leave that for the next time we have this conversation. I think we're going to do a part 2 on this, right?
Yes, there will be a part 2, inshallah.
Okay, inshallah.
So, you mentioned something about red flags, and you said you would give us a little bit more insight as to what those red flags are.
So with red flags, one of the things that I would definitely pay attention to is, how does this person communicate when they are upset? Does this person shut off? Does this person just start to ignore me? Does this person have a conversation about it? Are they willing to listen? Does this person yell at me or belittle me? Does this person talk to someone else about it and expect that person to talk to me, triangulating, right? So in terms of red flags, a couple of things that we want to pay attention to is, number one, how does a person manage conflict? Because that's where a lot of our more difficult emotions are coming up. And knowing how to deal with those is like crucial to having a healthy relationship. And that's in any relationship, parent, child, friends, siblings. But when you're getting married, you're now talking about someone who is entering into your life. And, with other people, they kind of just, these dynamics develop and you don't realize it, and friendships you can walk away from, siblings, too bad, they're your siblings for the rest of your life, right? But marriage, I mean, there's just so much more at stake, and you want to be more intentional about these things, right? So that's, in a red flag would be, a style of emotional regulation where there's belittling, name calling, or like a punishment type of, I'm going to ignore you. You have to apologize to me before I talk to you again. Those kinds of things are definitely red flags. Those are indicators that there might be more of an abusive type of tendency to the person. And then other things that, you want to be aware of are the things I mentioned, right? So whereas it might not be a red flag for one person, if a potential spouse is a spender, let's say, it could be a red flag for another. If there's one person that's extremely conservative in their spending, then a partner who wants to spend like $5,000 on a luxury item that isn't necessary, that might be a red flag. That's not necessarily a bad thing, right? If a person has the means and they've, paid their zakat, like that's not necessarily a bad thing, but for some people it might be. They might not be able to tolerate or come to terms with that kind of spending. So, and I keep kind of coming back around to the same thing, that self-awareness is so necessary. It's so necessary, Another thing when talking about red flags is looking at the relationship that this person has with their family, right? Are they stuck in a very negative pattern with their parents, right? And again, there's so many different scenarios that could come forward with just this under this topic, right? And so just because a person doesn't have a good relationship with their parents doesn't mean that in and of itself is a bad thing. But if they're not aware and they don't see that it's a negative pattern, that could be potentially harmful. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yes. So I guess if anyone has any questions, they can post it in the comments section and we'll take questions and answers. Correct, Sister Menahal?
Yep.
Okay. Also, if someone wants to send their question anonymously, they can text this number and we will post it, inshallah. So the number I just shared is a number where you can text your questions anonymously and Sister Menahal will be able to answer them for you.
So while people are posting their questions, what I'll do is I'll continue just addressing a little bit more about this piece of, what to talk to what questions to, ask your potential partner. Some I already mentioned, right? How did your family express love, right? How did they show courtesy to one another, right? How did your family deal with anger, right? Um, how did your, family, what did they do when they were sad? How did they express excitement, happiness, right? Um, and so those are questions to ask. Another piece that I kind of touched upon and didn't go into is asking a potential partner about their relationship with their own parents, right? And one of the questions that I ask premarital couples is, what aspects of your parents' relationship do you want to bring into your own relationship? What did you really appreciate about their relationship? And also, what aspects of their relationship do you definitely not want in your relationship? Because that tells us a couple of things. It tells us, number one, just the nature of the relationship that this other person was brought up in. And number two, their level of awareness, right? If they say my parents' relationship was perfect and I want to do everything just like they did, well, okay. I mean, I need to hear more about that. But, is there some critical thought in terms of what maybe worked for them but won't work for you? Or maybe what aspects, it's not to say that they were bad people. It's not to blame them or to judge them, but to say there are things that they did that I want to do differently. Right. And so asking a potential partner about, their relationship with their parents, and then specifically their relationship with the same sex parent, right? So if it's you're a female talking to a male, saying, tell me about your relationship with your father. What were some really positive traits about your father? What were some negative traits? What do you want to do similarly or differently than your, father? If it's a woman, than your mother, right? So again, bringing to light some an awareness. So like, if a person had a very negative, right? So if this is like baseline, and a very negative, like a father that wasn't present, and a father that was abusive, and a father that was, just not kind, right? And they say, yeah, my father was like this. And they, what's the baseline for that person? Because if they say my father was here and I'm going to be here, it's still not a baseline, right? And so getting to an awareness of, okay, so what does healthy look like? What is the ideal in your mind? We have our sense of what the ideal is, best case scenario, and a sense of like what's the worst case scenario. And usually reality falls somewhere in between that, right? But asking these questions and having very overt conversations, and that's necessary for marriage, to not hide, behind formalities, right? And so, okay, yeah, so be curious, tell me more about that, right? Asking the other person about these things. And if they don't want to talk about it, if they're getting upset about it, that tells you something. It might mean that they're ashamed. It might mean that they don't want to talk about it. It might mean that they're feeling blamed, right? So there are a number of things that could be coming up. And, but approaching this from a lens of saying, I really want to understand this person's history. I've taken time to understand my own history and what's important to me. And, therefore I want to understand your history so I can understand what's important to you, to see if we can come together for the long run. Right? Yes. Sorry, I think you're muted, Sister Anna.
Sorry about that. Anyone who has any questions can post it in the comments section, or you can text the number that I have in the comments section. We will answer them, inshallah. Okay, I have a question. What about narcissistic type husbands? People say they can never change. Islamically, what do you think? If we work on the relationship, is change possible?
Whew, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
Because here's the thing. This person used the word narcissist type. Those are the words. Now, I don't know if that means that the person is a narcissist or if they are just very controlling, because those are two different things. If we're talking about a narcissist, right, we're talking about not just controlling, but emotionally controlling and or manipulative. We're talking about gaslighting. We're talking about financial abuse, right? Which is different than, so someone might say, oh, my husband is the earner and he has all the accounts and, he's financially abusive. And meanwhile, that might be a husband who says, you spend a lot of money, I'm going to give you an allowance and you get to do whatever you want with that, but I have to manage the household expense. That's not financial abuse, right? It might not be the healthiest situation because this couple hasn't had a conversation about, their goals and financial responsibility and stuff, but it's not abuse. However, I've seen situations where the husband is the breadwinner. He will not allow his wife to bring in an income, but he also she has no allowance. Every penny that she spends is accounted for. Every penny that, she cannot use a single penny without it being, like criticized or somehow, accounted for. That level of financial control is financial abuse, right? There might be other kinds of, putting down, constant, not just criticism, but like belittling, right? So a narcissist lives in a world where they need to have control, they need to have attention, they need to have power, they need to be the center of attention, right? And so in that kind of a situation, you'll probably also have abusive behaviors, likely to have, if not, physically, then at the very least emotionally, where you can never actually express yourself. You can never actually, and even if you get an indication that the person is being nice to you, that you're probably a victim of narcissism if you start worrying right away of like when the second shoe is going to drop and they're going to turn back and like, yell at you, right? So that is a far different situation than, one in which there's a more traditionally cultural patriarchal mindset of a person that says, a man is at the head of the household. He is, in charge of how things run, right? That is not everyone's cup of tea, but also if there's a couple that agree to that, that's not wrong. But then there might be some discrepancy in how that being head of the household looks, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is everything I just said pertains to this narcissistic type. That's the first piece we have to understand, which is are we saying like someone who kind of is like kind of controlling and a little, like rah, 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 or is it someone who's like actually a narcissist, right? We have to really, really make that distinction, because if it's someone who's actually a narcissist, that person will never actually accept that they're a narcissist. They will actually never they're like, absolutely not. I'm not a narcissist. You're the narcissist. Look at you. You're so selfish. You're so this, you're so that, right? And they won't back down. And so in that case, I'm not going to say that recovery from that is impossible. I'm a firm believer in the human capacity, mentally, emotionally, physically, to heal, because even at the root of narcissism, there is trauma there. However, that doesn't justify the abuse that they are now perpetuating onto another, whether it's a spouse or children. Some of the worst impacts that I've seen are on the children of narcissists. May Allah protect all of our children.
I mean,
and so in that kind of a situation, there might have to be a serious consideration of whether or not it's healthy to remain in the relationship. However, in the situation of a person who's not actually a narcissist, but in like our current society, this is not the standard anymore, but this person abides by those standards, then in that situation, they're just maybe a little stubborn, or, a little bit more, authoritarian, right? In that kind of a situation, I think that, it's worth understanding a little bit more. It's worth trying to find different ways of communicating, trying to, work through it, because again, we don't want to break up relationships just under the guise that someone is, too controlling, because that's something that you want to try your best, and try different, see a therapist, find different ways to try to communicate with this person. I've seen people, like couples like this, come into therapy for marriage counseling and alhamdulillah make a lot of progress, where one partner is more like, where another therapist has said, yeah, I think that your husband or your wife is a little, they've got some narcissism or something. And it wasn't really narcissism. And it was, there was improvement made. Right.
So Sister Menahal, with the case of a narcissist, an actual narcissist, and they won't admit any of their behaviors, is there a chance for change?
Change comes from a person's willingness to change. We can never see. Here's the thing that I tell people when they come into therapy, especially when they're coming into individual therapy and they have issues with a relative, whether it's a family member or a spouse, whatever, right? You do not go to therapy to change other people. There's actually a funny meme that floats around, is like, we're all in therapy because of the people in our life who won't go to therapy, right? And so what we can do is change our own behaviors. We can change how we interact and and sometimes that's really hard, because there's, again, parts of our mind and our body, our own trauma response system is activated in a way that it's really hard to break patterns, right? But in any kind of a relationship, there's a pattern that two people are stuck in. And if, even one person changes their behavior, it's going to shift the pattern in some way, shape, or form. Initially, it'll probably make things worse, right? Because if, I have a family member that's used to me always saying, yes, 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 okay, yes, okay. And then now I say, wait a second, but that's really like, it's at the expense of myself. I can't do anything for myself. I can't, and then all of a sudden now I start saying, you know what? That person, like, what the heck? You're so selfish. Because I'm changing the pattern. So it's going to incite a reaction to start, but over time, if I can say, yeah, I get that you're upset, but I just can't do it. Over time, I change myself and how I'm dealing with it.
Right.
It will change the pattern in the relationship. I don't know if the other person is going to change. If they do, that's a great, nice side effect, but I don't do it for the sake of changing another person. And that's what we have to keep in mind.
Great. We do have another question. What if the guy is a mama's boy and relies on you to make them a better Muslim, and also has a mother who would completely control your mahar gold?
I was just having this conversation with a friend of mine recently. It's really tough, right? Because we have to define what it means to be a mama's boy. We have, both ends of the extreme, which is, one is like a person who's so guilt-ridden or so has been conditioned to, like, only listen to their mother, and the mother is unreasonable and too controlling, or, wants to have a say in everything. And in that case, that's not healthy, because there just isn't a proper enough. The marriage is its own thing. The mother-son relationship is its own thing. They're both important, and you can't keep mixing the two. And where mom is infringing onto the rights of the wife, that's a problem. But now we also see the other end of the extreme, where, there are situations where if, either spouse wants to, like, have their mother be a part of their life, they're just completely pushed away and saying, no, that's too much. And, it's almost like we go to the other end of the pendulum, where it's like, don't have your mother involved at all, or, any little, even kind of like getting the opinion of one's mother seen, deemed mama's boy, right? So again, I would say, we have to look at, what does this mean? Are we, in an attempt to make sure that our rights are not violated, are we in turn causing our spouse to violate the rights of their parent? And these are some, again, things are not black and white. If a mother is controlling how much mahar is being given, I would say that that's something that's worthy of, a little bit of curiosity at the very least, right? Is it because the parents are actually giving the son money for the mahar? If the son is earning his own amount and there's an appropriate amount, and you know, so again, it's very hard to say, because like, what if the son is like in love and the parents are seeing red flags and they're trying to, like, caution their son and say, hold on, think about this, right? This is what's reasonable. We know you can do that much, but just think about it, right? Like, that there's maybe room for that. But also, if they're just like, no, you can't give that much and you can only give this much, that's questionable, right? So it's very hard to put this in like black and white terms.
Okay. Another question is, what can we do to make parents understand that the way parents expect you to just consent for you to marry anyone they bring for you, that this isn't the right person for you?
That's a very big question. And, at the end of the day, parents may not understand. And I think, again, here, if parents are forcing marriage upon a person, that's not okay. Islamically, that's not okay. Ethically, legally, like, that's not okay for, for marriage to be forced upon a person, or for a person to be guilted into marriage. I would want to know, because here's the thing, I see both sides of the spectrum, right? I see situations where adult children are guilted or forced into marriage, and they're just miserable. They know that this is not for me. And I also see the other side of the spectrum where parents, it's appropriate age, a person is able to get married, but they themselves have, for whatever reason, issues with commitment. And just say, nope, 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 And it's not that the parents are forcing them to marry a particular person, but really pushing them to consider marriage. In that case, I think that the person who's asking the question needs to do an assessment to either gather the courage and stand their ground and say, no, I'm not marrying someone who I think is not appropriate for me. And or say, you know what, I'm taking some time to understand why I don't want to be in a relationship, why I keep running away from people without actually giving them a fair chance, right? In either situation, a person has to know kind of what's going on for themselves. Is it because, parents have a different set of values and you have a different set of values? And in that case, you have to stand your ground. And I don't necessarily know that there's going to be a way to make parents understand. Inshallah, they will eventually understand, but I don't necessarily know that there's like a script that I can give you for that.
Okay, sounds good. One question: what are some important questions to ask a man before getting married when talking to them?
So I already mentioned some of those questions, right? Asking them about their relationship to their parents. If you're talking to a man about marriage, ask him about his relationship with his father. What were the traits of his father? If you see that this person is kind of like filled with criticism, I would say that's a red flag, because it's not only, there's one thing to know the parts of your, family that you don't appreciate, and that's normal and okay, but to be very critical and almost like have a little bit of a little bit of an arrogant stance, like, oh yeah, my father was this and that, and to be very critical. And if you see that kind of, again, I'm talking based on situations that I've seen, right? Like, if a person seems to put everyone down, that's not that they're being objective and saying, yeah, my father, he really didn't know how to be emotionally open. He's saying, yeah, my father was never available, and da-da-da-da. They're getting angry, or they're getting like a little bit of holier than thou attitude. That's a red flag. But to answer the question, questions to ask someone, ask them about their parents' relationship. What aspects did they appreciate that they want to bring into their marriage? What aspects did they not appreciate that they want to make sure they do differently? Similarly, how did your family handle ... and fill in any of the things that I mentioned before, right? showing love, managing anger, dealing with conflict, showing, celebrations, showing gratitude or, appreciation, all of these things.
Beautiful. Well, it was a pleasure having you join us today, Sister Menahal. This was a very insightful session. Inshallah, our next session will be April 4th at 11 p.m., same time.
11 a.m.?
11 a.m., sorry. We hope everyone joins us. If you have any questions, you can always, or feedback about this program, you can text the number listed in the comments section. And Jazakallah khairan. We pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants everyone looking righteous spouses, inshallah. And we appreciate you joining us today, Sister Menahal.
Jazakumullahu khairan. I pray that it was beneficial.
Allah yabarak fikum. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.